Welcome. What we're going to do now is, as we said in the last clip, what we're going to do now is that we are going to examine various forms of commentary, understanding, and interpretation of some of the perspective from Abraham and Sarai's position. In other words, we're going to focus now on what goes on in terms of the interpreters, various commentaries. How did they understand Avraham and Sarai's behavior? Afterwards, we will do a brief exercise in the forum part of this course in order to explore from Hagar's perspective. But now we're going to focus on a variety of different, contrasting, and commentaries that actually contradict one another. And that's intentional in order for us to be able to expose our students to a variety of different kinds of perspectives. And this is all part of the interpretation form of reading that we discussed earlier. Okay, so here we go. The verse says the following: "But Abraham said to Sarai, Behold, thy maid is in thy hand, do to her as it pleases thee. And when Sarai dealt harshly with her, she fled from her face." So, the first interpretation is the one that we're going to look at from the Abarbanel. Sarai saw Hagar being pompous and acting in a bad way. Now, right away, the Abarbanel is assuming that Sarai feels that Hagar is being pompous and acting in a bad immoral way, and therefore Sarai afflicted her and treated her harsher than before, and all of this was done for a just purpose. And what's that just purpose? To bring her, Hagar, back to her proper place, to understand her role. And she, Hagar, as a person without moral strength, fled from her to the desert. What the Abarbanel is saying, in terms of understanding Abraham and Sarai's perspective, is that Sarai did this because Hagar was acting out of line. In other words, according to the Abarbanel, Hagar was abusing her position, not respecting Sarai, and therefore this was done, as Abarbanel says, for a just purpose. That's one interpretation. Let's look at additional ones. Here's one from the Sforno. The Sforno says, Sarai dealt harshly with her to force her, Hagar, to recognize her subordinate position and not be insulting in her demeanor, and to show, and here's critical piece, that this will be the consequence of anyone who insults Israel. As it says, and all that despise thee shall bow down at the soles of thy feet. Now, this is a critical interpretation, I believe, because if you remember in a previous lesson, we talked about figuration. Figuration, which says that many times that the interpreters, the commentators, were using the possibility of taking commentary, reflecting on a biblical passage in order to shed light and to understand and to appreciate their current situation. And here we see a clear example of how Sforno is using the biblical text to show that in his time, the consequence of anyone who insults Israel will be that they despise thee, they shall bow down at the soles of thy feet. In other words, it's clear here from the Sforno's perspective that there's an example of figuration. And this, I believe, is a critical lesson that we may want to give over to our students. 3, here Radak introduces a very different perspective. And Sarai afflicted her, she treated her too harshly, and forced her too much. Here, the Radak, as opposed to the previous two interpretations, he says, perhaps Sarai beat her and cursed her, and Hagar couldn't bear this any longer and fled, and Sarai didn't behave with the proper degree of morality and not with the proper degree of piety. And the way Sarai acted did not find favor in God's eyes. Wow. Here we have a very different, radically opposing position to the previous two interpretations that we saw. Here, Radak is clearly condemning Sarai's actions. And he says, Sarai treated her too harshly and forced her too much. Now, when we think of this in cultural diversity, in other words, the strong person, Sarai in this case, mistreated and cursed her, the weaker person. Now, here's an opportunity to discuss cultural diversity from the biblical verse from the perspective of Radak, from the perspective of a traditional commentator. And that's critical for us, is to show our students that some of the biblical commentators were sensitive enough to the affliction of the weak in order to reflect this in this interpretation. And when we look at Nachmanides, he goes even further in the 15th century. And Nachmanides goes even further in the sense that he says Sarai sinned in afflicting her, and also Abraham for permitting it. Now, Radak condemns Sarai. Here, Nachmanides goes even further and says that also Avram for permitting is being condemned. God hearkened to Hagar's cry, and as a result, her descendants persecute and afflict the seed of Avram and Sarah. In other words, Nachmanides also includes Abraham in blame for what happens, and argues that there were consequences. The consequence is that her descendants, Hagar's descendants, persecute and afflict the seed of Avram and Sarah. Here too, you see an example of figuration in terms of Nachmanides saying, we are suffering today in Spain in the 15th century as a result of what happened in this biblical story in Genesis and Bereshit 16. Now, Nechama Leibowitz, a 20th century commentator whom we looked at more deeply earlier on in the course, she brings in something else. She says the following: no appraisal of Sarah's character can condone the sin of Sarah dealt harshly with her. Perhaps the Torah wished to teach us that before one undertakes a mission that will tax all his moral and spiritual powers, he should ask himself whether he can maintain those same standards to the bitter end. Now, what Nechama Leibowitz is emphasizing here is that Sarah should have realized her own limitations. She should have asked herself, should she have offered Hagar as a slave to cohabit with Abraham? This, according to Nechama Leibowitz, was something which was out of character, which is something which Sarah could not bear. Because otherwise, if you take this on, one is liable to descend from the pinnacle of altruism and selflessness into much deeper depths than would ordinarily have been the case. In other words, what Nechama Leibowitz is suggesting, that there was a flawed decision by Sarai. When she thought of the possibility of offering Hagar to Abraham to bear his children, she should have realized the possible consequences. So what Nechama is introducing here is, not only was the mistake in terms of the actions, but there was a mistake in terms of thinking of the strategy and what that would include for the future. And finally, we're going to look now at Nachum Sarna, 20th century commentator, who says, like the wild ass among the beasts, so are the Ishmaelites among men. In their nature and destiny, they call to mind the sturdy, fearless, and fleet-footed Syrian onager, who inhabits the wilderness and is almost impossible to domesticate. In other words, he's saying that Hagar, the abused slave woman, subjected to the harsh disciplines of her mistress, will produce a free people and undisciplined. What Sarna is saying, he's trying to interpret what does the verse mean towards the end of the episode when it's related to Hagar by the angel that her son will be a wild ass of a man. What does that mean? Is that something negative, or perhaps a people free and undisciplined? This adds a new element to our understanding of cultural diversity about the need to appreciate the differences between various people. So what we've tried to do here is we've tried to expose our students to a variety of very different contrasting and contradictory interpretations of the story, because there's a value question here which screams at us that we as readers of the Bible have to undertake, we have to wrestle with, and we offer a variety of different interpretations to allow our students to examine various perspectives, to appreciate what this complex issue is all about, and ultimately to understand and appreciate the differences between Hagar and Abraham and Sarai. Thank you.